You also observe in the art world that people socialize and sometimes even live where they work, which is also the case with wine. Do you think that creates a culture also of drinking your own Kool-Aid and not experiencing life more broadly for those who create art and wine?
That's interesting. I think that it is so part and parcel to also getting ahead in these different worlds. And I think that that also can create opportunities, but I think it can be unfair. Those up and coming artists, they're working 1, 2, 3 jobs so that they can go home and in the dregs of the day do the work they want to do, which is their artwork. So forget having a family or kids. I mean, it's hard to spend all of your time bopping around openings and networking.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 286. How are innovators making art and wine more engaging and accessible? What is it about the art and wine worlds that makes business and pleasure often one and the same? And is authenticity in art and wine important? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in part 2 of our chat with Bianca Bosker, author of the New York Times bestselling books, Get the Picture and Cork Dork. You don't need to have listened to part 1 from last week first, but I hope you'll go back to it, if you missed it, after you finish this one. 3 of you are going to win a copy of Bianca's terrific new book, Get the Picture. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and let me know that you'd like to win a copy. I'll choose 3 people randomly from those who contact me. I also still have 2 copies of Barbara Scott Goodman's book, Wine Bites, on wine and food pairing with recipes to give away. Just email me for that as well. If you haven't won a book, now's your chance. And keep listening, as my goal is to offer lots more books and other prizes with every episode. You can qualify no matter where you live. As I mentioned last week, I've just started recording the audio version of Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, and I've promised to share with you the behind-the-scenes insights into the process. So audiobooks represent the fastest growing segment in publishing, with sales up 20% over last year. They were already popular before the pandemic, but they really soared when we all had to bunker down with in-home entertainment. The pace of their growth hasn't stopped since then. Some publishing experts believe that audiobooks will actually have a longer shelf life than their print counterparts. The ideal timing to launch an audiobook is when the print and ebooks are published, so that you can capitalize on the marketing efforts and appeal to those whose only mode of consuming books is auditory, like me. That said, it's been 1 year now since the Wine Witch print and ebook launched, so this is going to be more of a secondary launch with a separate company, but it's still worth doing, especially since I've heard from so many people who are waiting for this format. This includes a surprising number of people who are vision impaired and who are so loyal to this podcast. It makes me happy to be able to serve these listeners in a meaningful way. I don't have a launch date yet, but when I do, you'll be sure to know. In the meantime, I hope you'll wish the little Wine Witch a happy birthday, since she just turned 1, on social media and tag me. The memoir is now one of 9 books in the Best Culinary Narrative category for the 2024 Taste Canada Awards, the Oscars of Canadian food and drink writing. Have you read the Wine Witch paperback or ebook? If yes, well then have you bought a copy for a friend or family member? Please consider doing that if you'd like to support this podcast that I do for you on a volunteer basis to ensure it continues. You can order it for yourself or someone else from any online book retailer now, no matter where you live. It usually arrives in a day or two, and of course the ebook is instant. It's a fast read, and every little bit helps spread the message in this book of hope, justice, and resilience. You can send a copy directly to a friend or family member via the online retailers and make their day when a gift arrives in the mail rather than another bill. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemaclean.com/286. I also offer a free companion guide that has book club and wine group discussion questions that can also spark a conversation between two friends or a partner and spouse. It asks questions such as how you feel about your own relationship with wine, especially post-pandemic, marketing tactics toward women and men, and whether social media is still a good place to connect with others. The guide also has wine recommendations, pairings, and tips for organizing your own informal wine tasting, and you can get that at winewitchonfire.com. If you've read the book or are reading it, I'd love to hear from you. If your book club or wine group plans to read it, let me know if you'd like me to join in via Zoom. I also have a summary sheet that you can send to book club members who are deciding on upcoming books. Email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. Okay, on with the show. So you know in Get the Picture that there are a lot of entrenched, often self-appointed gatekeepers. That's very much like the wine world. You have not only new voices, old guard, but new world, old world, or countries are slotted into those definitions. Do you think the art world or the wine world is one of them is better at succeeding at bringing in new voices, or the rebel alliance, as you call them, to the fore? Or do they both have their own issues, but they're different?
I think they both have work to do. I think that part of the reason that I think what I hoped with both of these books, with Cork Dork and with Get the Picture, is that, I hope that they were the sort of book that like someone who had spent years collecting art or working at a museum, or someone who had, spent a lifetime tasting Burgundy could read and discover something new, but also someone who'd never stepped foot in a gallery or someone who'd never bought a bottle of wine could read them, be compelled to make art or wine a part of their lives.
I think you've achieved that goal with both books.
Oh, thank you. I really hope so. I mean, I hope that doesn't sound, overly ambitious, but why do something unless it's ambitious? And so I think that there's a lot of people who are trying to do that in their own and different ways. And I think that's incredibly exciting. I think that here in New York, I ended up working for Paul Greco, who runs Terroir, and I loved.
He's a Canadian, by the way.
Yeah, yes, he is. And, he was someone who I think I had never read a wine list that made me laugh until I stepped foot in Terroir. And I think he's done really fascinating wine classes and just things that mix things up. And I like the way that it feels like an interesting kind of experimental approach of like, yeah, how do we kind of change the conversation? What didn't? I mean, if you've ever seen his wine list, like it's this combination of screeds and manifestos. Like there's a whole section where he compared like each Cru Classé, or like, I don't know, like each of the first growths of Bordeaux to like a different wrapper or something. It was just these insane meditations on life and wine. And the guy's just, a mad genius. And I think, likewise, there's so many people in the art world looking to bring art beyond the sort of intimidating format of the white cube. There's a gallery called Good Naked that will do art shows in the park and hang work, on trees on a nice day. So I think it's really exciting to see that there are a lot of people who want to move beyond that gatekeeping. And also, I think it's important. To me, I always got really frustrated. I think with art and with wine, people are always like, oh, it's like there's no rules. Like you can engage with it any way you want. And as someone who really felt totally adrift in being able to connect with art or wine, I found that advice really frustrating. So I was like, I just don't even know where to start. I have nothing to hold on to. I feel like I'm just slipping off of both of these things. And as a result, I'm just not engaging. And so I do think that it is important to give people the tools to think for themselves, to really be able to engage with art or with wine on their own terms. And I think with wine, I think there's oftentimes too much telling people what to taste instead of teaching them how to taste. And I think The art world can be guilty of something similar, but I do think that ultimately everything you need to have a meaningful experience of art is right in front of you. And that's not to say that we can't each work a little harder to exercise our eye, but it's not impossible to do so, and you don't need to spend a lot of money. You just need a little time and certainly the inclination and eagerness to do so.
Yeah, to expose yourself and, as you say, stay in the work. And I agree with you. It's, I think, unhelpful to beginners, especially to try to demystify or democratize wine to the extent that you say anything goes. Put ketchup on your ice cream and drink it with a Cabernet. Like, there's a reason some guidelines exist, and, a reason why I'm still teaching courses on this subject. It's kind of knowing what the rules have been so you know how to bend and break them to your own pleasure. Just some of your phrases are just, as was a Kirkus review said, you can make dust sparkle. Like, oh my, what a quote.
I love it. Thank you. I was excited.
Well deserved. Yeah, yeah. But you say, well, both worlds have their own strong social grapevines. Of course, you were saying how they're in the art world, they're talking about everything around the artwork more so than the art itself. But you have a phrase that says, gossip for art people is like echolocation for bats. You sent out signals of what you thought was great or derivative or phony, and then oriented yourself based on what came back. Do you think the social grapevine is helpful, or is it just another exclusionary tool in the art or wine worlds?
Yeah, well, I think that there's definitely a lot of gossip in both worlds. I mean, nothing gets people talking like a bottle of wine, right? But I think one thing that, as you're asking that, I realize that is similar about both is that there is the gossip, which is not always great. On the other hand, I do think that you have a strong culture of sort of mentorship. I mean, there is this idea of, for better or for worse, and I think often for worse, the rules of the trade are not written down, right? And it's really something that you learn through apprenticeship. It's something you learn by doing a stage in a restaurant, something you learn by finding a more experienced somm to be your mentor, or weaseling your way, as I did, into tasting groups with aspiring master sommeliers. In the art world, it can mean like working as a studio assistant to an artist. It can mean doing studio visits with other artists, or just kind of being in the mix so that you glean these sort of really crucial life lessons around how do you get a gallery? What should a contract say? Should you have a contract? I will say that I found it disheartening to learn that the sort of vow of silence that exists often in the art world extended not just to journalists like myself, but also to artists that were in it. And what I mean by that is, as I said before, I had a lot of trouble getting access into the art world. And I began to think that there is a way in which the art world views secrecy as key to its survival. Part of it is that, there are things that would pass for absurd, illicit, illegal in other realms. So if you haven't taken this mafia-like vow of silence, you're viewed as a risk. Some of it is also, I think, that withholding of information is a way to build mystique, to concentrate power in the hands of gatekeepers. But as I was saying, when I spoke to artists, I was disheartened to find that these people who had so much more at stake than I did, who had years more in this field, really were still befuddled on how to make a career in it. I mean, even basic things like how do you get a gallery to show your work, right? Were things that people had spent a dozen years in New York City trying to figure out. And so I do wish that some of these things were clear and more codified. On the other hand, like I said, I think these are both worlds where the good actors within them are very willing to be mentors, to be sources of support and guidance. And so I think that's the good side of the talking.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also observe in the art world that people socialize and sometimes even live where they work, which is also the case with wine. I mean, talk about winemaker dinners at night, and just the whole thing is very campish. Do you think that creates a culture also of drinking your own Kool-Aid and not experiencing life more broadly for those who create art and wine?
That's interesting. I mean, it could perhaps, but I think it is tough to criticize because I think that it is so part and parcel to also sort of getting ahead in these different worlds. And I think that also can create opportunities, but I think it can be unfair. I mean, I think it's a lot to ask. I worked for a dealer whose advice to artists who were trying to get galleries to show their work in New York City was basically like, you've got to go to openings all the time. Like, be at openings, make it your job to go to openings. Like, you got to be underfoot. You've got to make friends with artists, got to make friends with the people running the galleries. And I think that is on the one hand, not necessarily bad advice, but also I think we have to recognize difficult for many people. I will say that my journey through the art world was really focused on emerging up and coming artists. To me, that is the highest stakes and least covered part of the world. It's this place where we can see the bloody business of art history being made. And I really wanted to see, like, how does a work of art go from being this germ of an idea in someone's studio to this cultural icon that we obsess over in the halls of museums. I feel like all the decisions that shape that work are also decisions that shape us, right? Our idea of what art is, who makes it, why we should engage with it. And so in the process of focusing on those up and coming artists, I got to know a lot of people who, they're working 1, 2, 3 jobs so that they can go home and in the dregs of the day do the work they want to do, which is their artwork. And so forget having a family or kids. I mean, it's hard to spend all of your time bopping around openings and networking if you also want to be making art or, God forbid, like having a family. So I guess, it's all to say that, I think that to some extent, the way that these industries are designed necessitates that business is pleasure and pleasure is business and all of that. But yeah, I don't know that it's always necessarily for the best.
Yeah. Well, at least the restaurant world can be hard on family life, given the hours and not just the time you work, but the length of time you have to work, like art. This is just so interesting. But you suggest spending less time with the masterpieces, I believe, just correct me anytime I misquote, and more time with less discovered pieces, say in someone's home. I guess we kind of covered that in that. My question would be, don't we have to train first on the classes, then branch out? But I guess you're more nuanced than that in the book in terms of how you'd respond.
It's an interesting question. I mean, certainly with blind tasting, I felt like it was really helpful to like start with the noble grapes, right? And to, someone had given me the advice of like, start with the noble grapes and then, Sauvignon Blanc. If you're trying to figure out what Sauvignon Blanc tastes like, drink only Sauvignon Blanc for like a week or a month, right? And try and figure out its permutations as it moves from France to New Zealand to California. And I did find that really helpful. And I think that for me, being able to sort of say, because like the wine world is so vast, right? I mean, to try and taste your way through the grapes of Italy alone could take you a lifetime, right? And so I think I found it helpful to sort of say, all right, let's start with this handful of very frequently used grapes and like, then go on these sort of field trips to figure out like, again, how does the character of a Chardonnay change as it moves around the world? I did find that helpful. And I will say that, wine is still a huge part of my life, but I do a bit less blind tasting than I did before. And I'm now, I think, in that phase of having had that foundation, going off more adventurous excursions to try the Grillos of Sicily or the Ribolla Giallas of Slovenia. I think that I feel like I am sort of have that foundation to now explore a little bit more. And I think with art, you're right. I mean, I've encouraged people to spend a bit less time with the quote unquote masterpieces in museums and more time seeking out art by emerging artists, by artists that they don't know, that they've never heard of, going to, like you said, galleries in basements, going to art schools, just going off the beaten track a bit. I suggest that because I think that is really crucial to developing our eye. And I think that context is, of course, for me, I was on this journey to sort of understand, like I said, why does art matter and how do we engage with it more deeply? And I hope that people will find a number of different answers to those questions in the book. But for me, there were certain paths and answers that resonated more than others. And, I do think perhaps informed by my experience with wine, I do think that there's something to be said for people not outsourcing their taste to context and for instead really developing their own eye. And I think part of developing it, as I said before, is to expose yourself to different things, to things you don't know. And my hope is that if each of us do a little bit more to work that muscle to develop our eye, that we could maybe support a greater variety of artists, of art forms of expression. I think there's this myth in the art world that genius is in short supply. There's sort of this idea that you hear in a lot of galleries. It's a sort of the myth of artificial scarcity. Like you go to galleries, especially in art fairs, and it's like, hurry, this offer won't last long. Act now, right? And there's this sort of sense like, there's a limited number of really great artists in the world. In my experience, I don't buy that. And so I think it would be amazing if each of us could exercise our eye and, like I said, really engage with it on our own terms. And in the process, allow more artists and more different forms of expression to really blossom and flourish.
I love that idea. It's almost like we become a mini Medici, like sponsoring a little local artist or whatever.
Yes, which you can do. And I think with art and with wine, I think price is not necessarily an indicator of quality. And just for people who may, like me, have thought, well, like you can't buy real, original artwork without taking out a mortgage, what I used to think, you can buy art for $120. You can buy it for $25. It's a whole range out there. And I think that's really exciting. And I think at those prices, you can sort of afford to take a risk. And at the same time, like, you're supporting someone, supporting a different way of seeing the world. And that's huge. That's great.
I love that. I love that. Both worlds are, as you say, playgrounds of the rich that invite polite corruption. Love that. We've heard of fake bottles of wine being sold at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars. What's the most unusual or intriguing fake or con that's been played out in the art world?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. I actually just wrote a feature story for the Atlantic magazine about a particular case of art forgery that I found very fascinating. And it was basically a story about this trove of supposed paintings by Jean-Michel Basquiat, very famous artist who passed away. His paintings can sell for like millions and millions and millions of dollars. And so these pieces were discovered. They got the thumbs up from various experts. They were valued at millions of dollars. And they went and had a splashy show at an art museum. And then they were confiscated by the FBI on the grounds that they were forgeries. And so the piece sort of looks at this particular case, but it also asks this broader question of why is it still so hard to tell real artwork, fake artwork? And also, does it matter? And I do think that it is interesting to note that with art, I mean, the idea of a forgery is actually a relatively recent invention. We haven't always cared what was original and what was a forgery or what was a fake. And there is a philosopher who's also an artist who actually makes the case that forgeries are great artworks unto themselves. I mean, not only can they in many cases sort of give us this experience of beauty, many cases, like there's so many examples of throughout history of artworks that have been sort of real one day, fake the next, and then real again the day after that. And, really authenticity, which we like to think of as cut and dry, in the art world has been shown over time to be much more fluid than we may be comfortable with. And so this philosopher sort of proposed, like, okay, so not only can these forgeries really move us in the way that artworks can, but perhaps they themselves are great artworks in the sense that they make us question our assumptions. They make us look differently, at our way of looking at the world. They kind of make us uncomfortable. And so those are all things that he would argue that a great artwork can do. I found that a really intriguing argument.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And how did they figure out they were fakes?
So it's complicated, but basically there's always issues with provenance, chain of custody. I think, interestingly, unlike wine, where once you open the bottle of wine, you've just got to drink it on the spot, right? There's this issue of connoisseurship with art where it's like different experts can look at the same artwork and sort of rule on what they view to be its authenticity. There are many connoisseurs that disagreed with the authenticity of particular supposed Basquiat paintings. But what should have been the final nail in the coffin came when the person who had originally sold them admitted to forging most of the works. The owners of these works did not take that to be the final nail in the coffin. And so the piece is about the continued dispute and sort of their argument that these might actually still be real. But yes, if you want to learn more, you can read the piece and try and find pictures of the artworks themselves.
Huh, in the Atlantic. Excellent. What do you wish the art world would teach the wine world and vice versa?
I mean, I think that I wish for both of these worlds, like I wish that they would teach each other, but also the world at large. I think just how kind of essential these things are to our lives. I mean, I think that I encountered people in the art world who were incredibly dismissive of wine. They felt like it was this kind of overly hedonistic experience that couldn't really give you a profound experience of something. And so
Well, that's because the wine traditionally at gallery art openings is horrendous. They don't know what they're talking about. Second only to cheap weddings. I mean, come on, people. But
yeah.
anyway, yes, they dismissed it without giving it a chance the way they view art.
Yeah. Likewise, I think that art, as I said before, I think it strikes many people as being totally optional or even irrelevant. And like, I wish that the wine world, I wish the world at large really understood the way that spending time with art can not only change us as art viewers, but also change us as human beings. And I think for both books, like I've had people who are like, "Oh, I'm not going to read Cork Dork because I don't drink wine." And I'm always like, oh, yes, it's about wine, but it's also really about these forgotten senses of taste and smell and experiencing the world in a different way and experiencing more of the world. And I think people that do read the book, I hope like see that and understand that. I've had people say that. They're like, it's, I don't drink wine, but it doesn't matter. Like I still learned a lot.
Exactly. And about human nature. I mean, that's deeply embedded into both books. And I know for my latest book, Wine Witch on Fire, my most meaningful reviews have come from teetotalers who like, do not drink. And I take it as the highest form of praise. But, yeah. Anyway, your books are definitely, it doesn't matter if you have never
Yeah.
drank a drop of wine in your life, you still read Cork Dork and get the picture.
It would be really fun. I think, there was less overlap in the worlds than I had expected. I think, yes, there are a lot of these worlds both do attract people with considerable amounts of money. There's a big collecting culture in both, which requires having lots of zeros in your bank account. And, I do think that, and yet, like, I was surprised that there wasn't more connection and conversation. And I think it'd be really fun if we threw all these people together in a room more often and not just with the free wine and openings, which sadly, I will add, doesn't happen as much as I had thought. It definitely is in many openings, but more often it's like there's a big trash can with ice and beer. So,
Oh, that's very sad. Very sad. And you mentioned you learn by doing, and I do admire your approach very much, as has been reflected in the reviews of Get the Picture, like Tom Wolfe, George Plimpton, Joan Didion, and even, I think, Michael Pollan, who traces, the journey of meat back to the original cattle. I do think, I agree, it often yields deeper, richer insights. But do you think you might be changing the narrative by being in the middle of it versus leaving it undisturbed, so to speak, by just observing it?
yeah, I mean, I think that probably, certainly. I think that there's, merits to so many different approaches. And I'm so glad that different writers take different approaches. And, some people just do interviews, or there's obviously many historical texts. I just found, especially after Cork Dork, that I was really convinced in the value of getting in the middle of the action, of learning by doing. I mean, it's one thing for an art dealer to give you the polite answer to how they sell a painting, and quite another, as I've now experienced, to sell thousands of dollars worth of art from the backseat of an Uber during Art Basel Miami while people are doing cocaine around you. And I think that, yeah, certainly I'm there and people know that I'm a writer. So of course that changes things. But, nonetheless, I think over time, I think it still just offers for a richness and a depth of understanding that I really value as a human being and as a writer.
And how did you get them to let their guard down, or did they? Because they did know you're a writer or journalist going into their world.
Yeah, which makes it that much more surprising that some people did and said some of the things that they did. But I let people read the book to figure out what I mean by that. But I think that, of course, it's hard to know. I mean, of course, people, I'm sure, would be different in some sort. But I also think that, I was lucky enough to find people who were really excited about having me around, about the sort of collaboration that was. And so it isn't something that I worry about too much. But I think that I worked for a pair of gallerists, who they put that they just wanted to see more people love art. They wanted to bring more people into this world. And so they were excited to pull back the curtain to show what goes on and how to do it, and let me get in there and sell art with them, write press releases, spackle walls. But yeah, I mean, and then you had people who told me, there was one dealer who I worked for who pulled me aside one afternoon to tell me, you're not the coolest cat in the art world, so having you around, it's just like lowering my coolness. So, got advice to kind of change my wardrobe, tone down my enthusiasm, rethink some of the ways I communicated, all of that.
And again, you have some great phrases like a cactus chasing a balloon or something, and a chihuahua. Was it a chihuahua enthusiasm or something? So fun, your language. This time has gone by. Let's go to a lightning round, just quick answers, whatever comes to mind, Bianca. Which wines would you pair with these artworks? Jackson Pollock, an abstract painting by Jackson Pollock?
Well, so Jackson Pollock was a notorious alcoholic who died in an alcohol during a drunk driving accident. So I feel like in this case, I would probably drink very strong coffee. But I think generally for like that kind of abstract expressionist artwork, I don't know, champagne, like if I had to, like I just feel like there's some like effervescence to that work that I think some sort of like a sparkling wine would be, like you feel that, you look at the zhuzh and then you feel it from the inside as well.
I love that. Edgar Degas' Little Dancer of 14 Years, the sculpture.
Yeah, I feel like I wish she was 21 so she could drink. But I feel like for like Degas in general and sort of like that whole series of ballerinas, it would have to be something extremely classically and obviously French. And I think crisp, like something about the work to me is just like there's always this, I don't know, like a kind of
linearity or something.
Yeah, maybe, but just also like a luminosity to it. And so I think like a Chablis, I'd probably say like some super first growth Chablis. Not first growth, what am I saying? Not first growth, oh my God. Not July. But you know, like anyway, Premier Cru, like a really nice Chablis.
Yeah, cool. And people are going to have to read the book to find out who Mandy Allfire is. Fantastic live performance artist, but what would you pair with one of her performances?
Yeah, so Mandy Allfire was an ass influencer, performance artist. Also a nearly naked performance artist who sat on my face, which is how we met. I mean, gosh, I have to think more like a Budweiser heavy. I'm not going to lie. It was this opening. It was in the basement of a gallery. It was, there was wires hanging at the wall. It's more of like a can of beer in your hand. I don't know, but yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, or something, I guess, earthy. Yeah,
earthy.
Right. It's a good question.
Yeah, well, great answers. If you could share a bottle of wine with any person outside the wine world, living or dead, who would that be? And what bottle would you open?
I feel like this is every writer's answer, but like probably Joan Didion. What bottle of wine? I mean, I would be so excited to meet her and talk to her that I would probably drink, I would like pull out something really special, like, vintage champagne, like a really old vintage champagne. Or I would try and get something really high alcohol so that she would get drunk and stay and talk more.
That's great. All right. Cool. Went in the art world to develop your eye and into the wine world to develop your taste. I'd like to know which organ is next. Is it music, touch, dance, fashion? Is it instead of get the picture, maybe catch a tune, listen up, or move a muscle?
Yeah. I love all of that. I don't know yet, but I think all of those worlds and topics are really, really fascinating. And why not? I've thought about each of them in their own way.
Excellent. We can't wait, Bianca. I mean, we're greedy for your work, so keep writing. I mean, it's a real treat to read you and to talk with you.
And I'm so grateful. It's a real honor and a pleasure, and your kind words mean a lot coming from you. So thank you.
Thank you, Bianca. As we wrap up, is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to share? I'm also going to ask how people can find you and your books online, but is there anything else you'd like to mention?
I mean, look, I could stay here and talk to you for hours, so I feel like there's a lot of things, but no, I feel like we've, it's been a blast. It's been really great. And again, I'm really thankful.
Awesome. And your books, Get the Picture and Cork Dork, are available wherever books are sold online and book retailers. Where can we find you online?
Yep, there's audiobooks, there's ebooks. They're in different languages, soon to be Get the Picture in different languages. My website is biancabosker.com. On social media, I'm bbosker. And yeah, you're always welcome to reach out. It's bianca.bosker@me.com.
Excellent, Bianca. So I will say goodbye for now, and this has been a real treat. Cheers to you.
And to you, thank you so much.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Bianca. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, how are innovators making art and wine more engaging and accessible? As Bianca says, it's really exciting to see that there are a lot more people who want to move beyond the gatekeeping. With art and wine, she adds, some people say there are no rules, that you can engage with it in any way you want. And she finds that advice really frustrating. So do I, actually. She thinks it's more important to give people the tools to think for themselves, to engage with art or wine on their own terms. She also says that with wine, oftentimes there's too much telling people what to taste instead of teaching them how to taste. She thinks the art world can be guilty of something similar. It's not to say that we can't each work a little harder to exercise our eye or our palate. We just need a little more time and the inclination and eagerness to do so. Number 2, what is it about the art and wine worlds that makes business and pleasure often one and the same? Bianca observes that mixing the two is part of getting ahead in these different worlds, but it can be difficult for up-and-coming artists who are working at several jobs so that they can then go home and in the dregs of the day do the work they actually want to do, which is their artwork. Bianca says they have to forget having a family or kids, since it's hard to spend all of your time bopping around to openings and networking. I'd say there's a lot of similarities in the wine world because the business pleasure events of winemaker dinners and so on, they're all in the evening. Number 3, is authenticity in art or wine important? Bianca says it's interesting to note that with art, the idea of a forgery is actually a relatively recent invention. We haven't always cared for what was original and what was a forgery or a fake, and that there is a philosopher who's also an artist who makes the case that forgeries are great artworks unto themselves. Authenticity, which we like to think of as cut and dry, in the art world has been shown over time to be much more fluid than we are comfortable with. This same philosopher proposed that not only can these forgeries really move us in the way that artworks can, but perhaps they themselves are great artworks in the sense that they make us question our assumptions and they make us uncomfortable. So those are all things that he would argue that a great artwork can do. She found that a really intriguing argument. I do too, and I think the same can be applied to wine, of course, if it hasn't been turned to vinegar. In the show notes, you'll find a full transcript of my conversation with Bianca, links to her website and books, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. You can also find a link to take a free online wine and food pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemclean.com/class. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/286. Email me if you have a sip tip question or would like to win one of 3 copies of Bianca's terrific book, Get the Picture. I also still have 2 copies of Barbara Scott Goodman's Wine Bites on wine and food pairing with recipes to give away. And of course, I'd love to hear from you if you're reading my book. Email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. If you missed episode 58, go back and take a listen. I chat with Madeline Paquette about how art and visuals can help us understand wine and remember what we learn. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
What is flavor? Why do I taste the things that I taste? And it's profound. Every single person has these taste receptors on their tongues, and they associate differently based on who you are. So if your Sauvignon Blanc tastes like peaches and strawberries, and my Sauvignon Blanc tastes like grass and jalapenos, we might actually be drinking the same glass of wine, but we have an entirely different taste perception of it. So this book is empowering because it can help people discover their flavor of Sauvignon Blanc and the way they might experience that wine. It's all based on aromatic compounds, which you probably get asked this all the time, Natalie. If I'm smelling strawberry wine, does it mean it actually has strawberries in it?
You won't want to miss next week when we chat with Mark Millon, author of Italy in a Wine Glass, The Story of Italy Through Its Wines. He's also written numerous other books, such as Wine, A Global History. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell a friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about the parallels between the worlds of wine and art. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie McLean Wine on their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that you consider a masterpiece. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.